Welcome to the Make Next Happen podcast, where we dive deep into the world of innovation and capital building. This podcast is for the visionaries, the change makers, and the leaders who are not satisfied with the status quo. It is for those who see beyond financial capital and understand the importance of building serious capital, including human, intellectual, political, reputational, and social.
At Solve Next, we believe that true innovation isn't just about having great ideas. It's about executing those ideas with discipline, structure, and the right resources. We created this podcast to share insights, stories, and practical tools to help you move from uncertainty to certainty and to realize your goals for what's next.
Whether you are leading an organization, managing a team, or driving change in your community, this podcast is for you. Join us as we explore how to make next happen, transform challenges into opportunities, and build a future that creates value on multiple fronts.
Welcome. Let's make next happen together.
In this episode, we're challenging the traditional focus on financial capital and exploring the power of serious capital, the kind that truly drives value and impact. Rick, welcome. Finally, we're here.
Yeah, great. Great to be in the room with you.
Oh, thank you. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, I had the privilege to interview Mohammed Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank, Nobel Prize winner. And I was impressed by his approach because he's a guy that is not only thinking about financial capital. When he creates his bank, he's thinking about more than that. But that's kind of weird. Most of the people think about only financial capital. And then you came with this concept of silly and serious capital. What's that?
Well, I love that you mentioned Yunus and the Grameen Bank because we'll look at them a little in another episode, I think, because it is an amazing model when you think about it. It seems obvious it's a bank and it'd be financial capital that they'd be focused on, but really what drives the value there is social capital, right? It's the connections between these women who are taking these small loans and what they're able to build together, and how that social fabric is the strength of that bank, and really a great example. So silly versus serious capital comes from really some thinking that we've been doing over the years in working with our clients and seeing organizations that are just focused on financial capital, not actually achieving the kinds of results or the kinds of outcomes that they want. And from our point of view, it's just too narrow a lens to look at innovation. It's too narrow a lens to look at the opportunities that you're pursuing. If you're only looking at a financial result, then you're going to end up with very sort of thin or fragile solutions, right? Mm-hmm. So it's inspired by work that is done, that we read, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a book called The New Capitalist Manifesto by Umair Haque. And he's an economist, a pretty provocative economist, who said that after 300 plus years that we need to update the model for capitalism. And he had this concept of thin versus thick value, or abundant versus scarce value. And really, it's building on that idea. So silly capital would be our way of being a little provocative to say, if you're only focusing on financial, you're being a little bit silly, that you need to get serious about what kind of value you're creating. And not every innovation opportunity is created equal. Some opportunities really ought to be putting a focus on, let's say, intellectual capital. Can we earn some credits in the patent bank, right? Or human capital. Can we save lives, or can we skill workforces up rather than financial capital? So I think you need to look at what is the real value that we want to create, and which capital is more freely available. It turns out financial capital is much more available than other forms of capital. It's often the easiest one to get to. It's the easiest one to measure, and so I think it's why people fall back on that. So as we think about this, we really want people to get serious about capital, to not be silly and not fall into this trap of a too narrow a view of what the opportunity is in terms of value creation.
Okay, so for me, it's easy to understand financial capital, and you gave us a couple of examples of intellectual capital. But what about political, reputational capital?
Yeah.
In which context, even if you are in your business, why is it important for you to build political capital?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's a great question, Danny. I think that maybe I do a little bit better job of defining what we mean by serious capital. So silly capital, as we mentioned, is this sort of thin or fragile approach to looking at capital. It's looking really only at financial capital. And if we want to have a more robust model, we talk about 6 forms of capital. Financial, yes, certainly. You want to look at the financial implication, because at the end of the day, any opportunity that you're pursuing is going to require some funding, and hopefully is going to generate some additional resource in the way of monetary compensation. But you also want to look at human capital. What kind of impact is this having on people? Is it providing them with skills? We do work in the defense sector. We also do work in the non-profit space fighting human trafficking. And there, human capital is much more valuable than financial capital. It's harder to affect. It's harder to change. And so the emphasis in those 2 efforts really ought to be on human capital, not financial capital. We also want to then look at intellectual capital. So if I'm in an organization that's really driven by technology and new methods and proprietary approaches to things, then we want to be accumulating credits in our patent bank. We want to know that we've got an advantage that comes from our ways of doing things that other people might find challenging or difficult to replicate, or the intellectual capital might attract other partners, as that sort of thing. So intellectual capital may be driving certain initiatives. Political capital can be really important as well. We have a client, it's the industry association. It works in the financial services sector. And its influence, while it can be very innovative around product or services, ultimately it's a highly regulated industry. So they need to put political capital at the top of their efforts, because if there's not changes in law, if there's not changes in policy, then they're not going to be able to actually affect the change with their new product or their new service. So they're not going to realize their financial objectives unless they can have influence in the US on Capitol Hill, right? They need to get lawmakers to change laws. So that form of capital becomes even more important. Or reputation capital. Let's say we're a Nike or we're an Apple or we're a Starbucks. Like, those are really well-known brands that have huge influence in terms of how consumers behave, what technologies they adopt, what cultural norms they adopt. And they really have to be serious about, is this new effort going to strengthen our brand, or is it going to put our brand at risk? So reputation capital can be really important. But that can come down to an individual and an organization as well. If I attach my name to this, how's that going to serve my reputation? And you can see leaders in organizations who are attracted to efforts, or who actually try to stay away from efforts because they see that there's some personal risk in that. So we need to be thinking about that form of capital. And then finally, we need to think about social capital. And back to your point with the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank was really, it's a group lending model. And at its heart, its business model is a social business model. It's about the group showing up, fostering a sense of community and solidarity among its borrowers, and empowering that group. So that empowerment actually steps over into the human capital space, right? So if we want to focus on education and healthcare initiatives, which is where they do a lot of their lending, why are they doing that? To create a productive workforce, a healthy, capable workforce. So the focus of Grameen Bank, they actually see financial capital as an outcome of an investment in human and social capital. And so you've got to think about, given the opportunity, given our mission or our purpose, how would we rank those forms of capital? And if you only look at it through the lens of financial, you'll be missing the meat of what it is that you're trying to do, and the opportunity that's really there to show up and make a difference in the markets that you serve. And I say markets, no matter what the sector is, if it's a public sector or private sector or social sector, you need to think about, who are we serving? Who are the constituents or communities or regions or nations that we're serving? And do those markets place a higher value on one form of capital or another? And where can we show up and make that difference? So maybe that explains a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that you mentioned Nike and Adidas, and these brands also comes to my mind, Patagonia.
Yeah, sure.
Which is a very nice brand, where they invested a lot in differentiate from the market by putting a lot of effort into building social climate capital, and then that builds reputation. Is that an example of if you invest in other kinds of capitals, bring you also financial outcomes?
Yeah, Patagonia is a wonderful example, because I think, I tend to think about the environmental capital they're creating as both a subset of social capital, sort of serves society, that we protect the environment that we depend on. It's also a form of human capital investment, because it enables productive lives to exist, that we're taking care of the places that we live. They're in the States where we have this, and I'm afraid this is something we've exported to the rest of the world, this sort of idea of Cyber Monday and Black Friday or whatever it is around Thanksgiving, where there's all of this hype around selling more and more and more. Patagonia is famous for running a full page ad saying, "Don't buy this jacket." So they actively communicate at the peak buying season. They actively promote this idea of not purchasing something. And the message that they say is, we're building clothes to last. And we don't want you to be in this cycle of constant consumption. We actually need to treat the world and the environment more responsibly than that. So things like their Worn Wear program and the Footprint Chronicles all support that. And that you can see that they've got an emphasis on social capital. They've got an emphasis on protecting the planet. And they understand that one of the results of that will be people will reward them financially, right? But it's not. I mean, I'm a Patagonia customer. I've actually, gone into a store with a coat that had a lining that was ripped. They said, we don't have that particular color, and we can't do the repair. So just pick a new one off the shelf, right? Or I have a messenger bag and I bring it in, and that messenger bag has been repaired 3 different times. So I've had it for over 20 years, and they're not interested in just selling me another one. So it's not just that focus on capital is for a financial outcome. It actually informs the entire way that they operate as an organization. And you can imagine, what kinds of talent does that attract? What kinds of people does it attract? What kinds of customers does it attract, right? It creates this really healthy, robust, resilient ecosystem for them.
Let me share a story with you.
Okay.
A few months ago, I witnessed this very interesting conversation between this father and his son. This is a family, they own a business. And this guy, the son, he wanted to build a fund to invest in startups. He wanted to create financial capital with that. But his father was scared. How is this going to affect the business that we already have? So it was this tension between protecting capital and creating capital. Mm-hmm. And I hear you saying that most of the people is always wanting to create, protect, or liberate capital. Why don't we talk a little bit about that and how you can do these 3 in these different forms of serious capital?
Yeah. I love the story, Danny. I think it's great. I'm always going to lean into Danny for good storytelling. So Danny's a collector of stories and loves telling stories. So I can see that. Not only do I can picture that exchange between the father and son very clearly. And that we've stepped into that father-son exchange in many different organizations as well, where you have some people in the organization who are in protection mode, right? They're very risk averse. They want to make sure that what they built, what they've accumulated over the years, isn't lost. They feel like we've done the work, we've accumulated this, and it makes people quite tentative about pursuing what's next, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have people who maybe aren't as invested, or they want to make their mark, like the son, right? I've got this opportunity to create my own legacy, to add on, to create something, to create the next for this organization. And they're a little less wedded and a little less concerned about what's there. And so you're right in that there are 3 responsibilities in building serious capital. There is the responsibility to create new capital. Mm-hmm. So can I create a stronger workforce? Can I protect lives? Can I create a future for a child by keeping them from being exploited in the human trafficking space, right? We can think about that. We can look at something like the political capital, which is, are we protecting our current standing? Do the politicians support us and write laws on our behalf? Or are we actually going to be able to influence and get people to create policy that's favorable for the new technology that we're creating? Think about AI right now. Certainly within the U.S., the Congress is scrambling to try to catch up to AI and think about, how do we control this? How do we regulate this? How do we make sure that it's used for beneficial purposes and not for harm? And I think we probably share some perceptions of politicians, and probably don't have huge confidence in them being at the forefront of technology. But that's something they need to be thinking about. Are we actually or creating the political capital and creating the relationships we need there to have policy that's favorable and productive. So in all these cases, am I protecting something? Am I creating something? And then there's that other category of, am I liberating something? This might be the secret to the son convincing the father, which is, let's look for places where capital is trapped or where capital is not being as productive as it could be, right? And let's look at, can we free that capital up? So if we look at a set of activities or existing organizations, say, is this really producing the human capital, the political capital, the reputation capital, the financial capital, the social capital? Is it producing what we want it to produce? And if the answer is no, or if it's not as much as it used to, or we think that's going to decline, then let's put that into a portfolio that allows us to exit, right? And we're going to talk about portfolios in another episode. But just to foreshadow that, the idea of saying there's a set of things that we can look at and we can say the cost of it in any form of capital is soon going to exceed the contribution that it's making. If we can liberate that capital and deploy it to new opportunities, to what's next for the organization, that's the secret, right? That's where you can get people to say, okay, you're not talking about taking what's productive and putting that at risk. You're talking about, let's take our non-productive activity and reorient that or redirect it.
So for our audience, the people that is listening to us, how can organizations shift their focus from silly to serious capital?
Good question. How do we shift from serious from a silly capital to serious capital? So that's a great question. How do we shift from silly capital to serious capital? I think first of all, just introducing a framework, right? So for many people, they don't even know where to start having the conversation. They intuit that what we're doing isn't sufficient. What we're doing isn't really going to get us where we want to go, but they don't have a framework to organize both their thinking and their actions. So by simply having a structured approach to this conversation, saying, let's think about whether or not we're increasing or decreasing our risk by only looking at financial, right? Is that the most robust approach we can take to this? Do we really value financial capital over all other forms of capital in every case? Or let's take a look at what we see as the opportunities to define what's next, where we look at the innovation opportunities that we're currently working on, whether they're about how we work internally or what we deliver in our markets. Let's look at those things and think about, for each opportunity, what is the most important form of capital. We might even weight those, and then think about, what do we think about how we're investing in those today and how we're organizing ourselves to deliver on those. So I think that at the heart of it is simply giving a simple framework and a structure for that. It will go a long ways. But I don't think having the conversation is enough, right? I think that the real secret is applying it to one thing, right? And we've had this conversation. We tend to like to sit back and think about the comprehensive theory. And I think one of our realizations recently was that you can't wait till somebody understands everything to do something, right? What we want to do is say, let's actually understand one thing so that we can start to and apply one thing and do one thing so we can start to understand everything, right? And so what I would urge people to do is look for an opportunity to apply the model. Look for an opportunity to test it out, to try it and see what you learn and see what kind of impact it has. And then share that evidence with whoever you're trying to convince. Don't try to convince them of the theory and to apply it across every opportunity. Look for a place where you can try it. Right?
And I also believe that this is great for the people inside an organization, this framework. For those who are in the building, inside there in the human resource area, they are building and creating and protecting human capital. For those who are in the PR, they're creating and protecting and liberating political capital. And having a framework, okay, I'm not building inside my organization financial capital, but this is my contribution. I think this is great.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I think that one of the things that we see is if you're only looking at it through the sort of silly lens or the thin lens of financial capital, then it's difficult for people to connect the dots of how am I contributing to that. And you see that in organizations' behavior. There's a reason why in a lot of organizations, the sales force gets a disproportionate amount of attention. It's because the sales force is the place that it's easiest to measure the financial capital impact, right? Are we selling or are we not selling? How many dollars or euros or pesos are we bringing in, right? And so you can, it actually creates an unhealthy orientation that all we look at is sales and everything else is secondary. And suddenly it's like, how is the rest of the organization supporting sales? As opposed to what you're saying, where you think about, well, if my job is to create a new brand or to protect our existing brand or to expand our brand, then the emphasis, my role is to create reputation capital. Mm-hmm. So I should be looking at a set of opportunities that primary focus is that, right? Understanding that an outcome of doing that may be that it contributes to other forms of capital. So I think you're absolutely right. It gives more people across an organization a sense of the value and the impact and why what they do matters.
Thank you, Greg. That's all for this episode on silly versus serious capital. In the next episode, we will discuss how to move from uncertainty to certainty as you pursue what's next. Thank you for listening. Now go out and make things happen.